I call Grant Robertson.
Well, that contribution will go down in the annals of parliamentary history for its enthusiasm, perhaps only brightened by Mr Scott's tie, which I'm a great admirer of, and as a constituent in my electorate, I fully approve of your purchasing goods and such as that inside the boundary of Wellington Central. Mr Speaker, the Labour Party is supporting this bill on first reading to the Select Committee. As has been noted by a number of other speakers before me, it essentially covers three areas, and I'm going to work my way through those now. The one that I want to focus on for the first part of my contribution is indeed the idea of the imposition of GST on what are called intangibles, remote services sold over the internet. And Mr Speaker, I'm sure you, along with many other New Zealanders, have perhaps got a Kindle and you download those books to read over the summer break, you know, those murder mysteries, things that you think about in the dead of night, what you might want to do to your colleagues, that kind of thing, Mr Speaker. And when you are thinking about downloading those onto your Kindle, they are the type of purchases that the government tonight in this House is proposing that GST be put on. They're proposing it to be put on an e-tailer who sells into New Zealand more than $60,000 a year worth of products. A reasonable suggestion, Mr Speaker, one that's been a long time coming, been suggested for some time. I know that people like Telecom will be very pleased, Spark will be very pleased with that. They have been looking for a more level playing field in their competition with Netflix and other providers of that ilk. So they will be happy. Those who are not so happy include the retailers and the booksellers. And in fact, Booksellers New Zealand's Chief Executive Lincoln Gould said that there was, quote, nothing for small business and their communities in this bill. And he's been joined by Retail New Zealand in their criticism of the bill, which, as they say, does nothing, Mr Speaker, to deal with supporting the small businesses, the main street retailers who currently work on an unfair playing field when it comes to this. And Mr Tabato has already given the example of a book that if you did download it to your Kindle, you would be purchasing something that attracted GST. But if you then ordered the book in hard copy from Amazon and had it mailed across the world to you, it doesn't attract GST. So the government has set up this unfair playing field because they've done the thing they always do. They've gone after the very, very easiest thing, the thing that doesn't take too much effort, and they've left alone the issue that New Zealanders, and in particular small businesses and retailers across New Zealand, wanted solved. And they've done worse than that, Mr Speaker, because they told the booksellers, the retailers of New Zealand, that they would be on to sorting this out. That's what they told them at the election last year. And the retailers were told in November there will be a discussion document available on this very issue of how to deal with goods that cross the border, not just the intangibles. And what happened when Todd McClay made the announcement of this piece of legislation, Mr Speaker? He announced that the discussion document, scheduled to come out in November of this year, will now come out in April of next year. Another delay of 5 or 6 months while the government kicks the can down the road, as they do on so many issues. Any issue that might require a little bit of challenge, a little bit of confronting themselves, kick the can down the road, a discussion document in April. I'll wager with you, Mr Speaker, that won't come out in April. It'll be later next year. The can will get kicked further down the road because this government never faces up to the tough issues. If the government is serious about creating a level playing field for New Zealand businesses, especially small businesses, have the courage of their convictions and put up a regime that actually creates that level playing field, not tinkering around at the edges. Mr Speaker, the second part of the piece of legislation in front of us today is around the question of the residential land withholding tax. And this is, as some other speakers have noted, part 3 in a horrendous trilogy from the government of stuff-ups in taxation legislation. If it is a trifecta, Mr Scott, it's paying very, very poorly. Because what we learned at the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee last week during the Inland Revenue Department's hearings is that the Bright Line test, which we've already been told is going to bring in $5 million, a pathetic sum of money relative to the trading of houses in New Zealand, costs $5 million to implement. $5 million comes in, and it actually is going to cost the Inland Revenue Department $5 million to implement it. It's cost neutral, Mr Speaker. Genius taxation policy. Cost neutral, but failing to actually get to the root of the problem of property speculation. And Mr Speaker, it will be interesting to see once again all of the tax experts come to the Select Committee, as they did in the first version of the Bright Line test, to say to the government, your policy doesn't make sense. It's got no coherence. One of the senior partners in the largest accounting firm in New Zealand came to the Select Committee and said he was professionally confused by the government's approach in this area. And they'll be back. They'll be back again to say, here you go, confusing the picture even more, Mr Speaker. So this really is throwing potentially good legislation after bad. There is very little in the government's approach to trying to look like it's dealing to speculation that has been good. This particular piece of legislation deals with those offshore who will be making purchases. It appears to set up a tax that makes some sense in that context, but it follows on from very, very poor legislation. And once again, Mr Speaker, and it's an example of taxation legislation that is simply inadequate for the problem that it seeks to address. It kicks the can down the road of a difficult issue. It gives the appearance of doing something. If it weren't for some of my colleagues, I'd call this Clayton's legislation. But that might give the government the wrong idea about what kind of legislation it is. But it is the kind of legislation that you do when you're not really doing legislation to address the problem, Mr Speaker. The third part of the legislation that's in front of us today is that dealing with student loans. And to give Mr Seymour his dues, he was about to launch into his views on the funding of tertiary education, which he one day hopes to undertake, I understand, Mr Speaker. And he actually said something that I agreed with. So we're going to need to mark this down, 8 p.m. on the 8th of December 2015. Mr Seymour said something I agree with, which is that when the interest-free student loan policy was set up, it was set up to be interest-free when you were in New Zealand. It was never set up to be interest-free if you went overseas. One of the reasons for doing this.
Point of order, David Seymour. Let's hope it is, in fact, a point of order. Sorry?
I said no such thing, and the member knows it.
That's not a point of order. It's a matter for debate, and you've had your debate.
Yeah. It wasn't that good either, Mr Speaker. So the interest-free student loan scheme was designed so that it was interest-free in New Zealand. If you went overseas, interest began accruing. There was some allowance for the kind of OE that New Zealanders undertake, or if you were working for a voluntary organisation or for the New Zealand government. That is part of this legislation to tidy up the way in which charitable organisations are defined when you don't attract interest when you're overseas, and it's good to see that being tidied up. More discretion is going to be given to the Commissioner of Inland Revenue. Read the bill, Mr Seymour, it's in there. More flexibility is going to be available to the Commissioner for Inland Revenue to decide if people are working for a charitable organisation. But the Labor Party supports following up that debt. We, through the interest-free loan scheme, made that scheme fairer, made that scheme more of an enabler for people to get into tertiary education, but we respect the fact that it is a loan scheme, that it does need to be paid back, and the relationship between the Inland Revenue Department in New Zealand and the Australian authorities is close enough to be able to share that information so that those who do default on their loans can be followed up. Mr Speaker, this was a loan scheme that the National Party now leader said that he would oppose with every bone in his body. when it came in. He said he would oppose it with every bone in his body. Well, that's failed. The National Party has continued on with it. They've tinkered around at the edges. They've managed to make the interest-free loan scheme more unfair and more difficult. They've taken away a number of the student allowance provisions. But on this particular piece of legislation involving student loans, the Labour Party can support it. So, Mr. Speaker, we will be supporting this bill to select committee. It's a bill that could have done so much more when it comes to cracking down on speculation in the housing market. But as is typical of this government's approach, it's tinkered at the edges, it's dipped its toe in the water and run away scared when it could have actually been doing something to give New Zealanders a chance to buy their own home and be part of the Kiwi dream. Maybe one day when we get a Labour government we can get that to happen.